Welcome, dear listeners, to Cabin of Horrors. I'm your host, Josh Myers-Haddon, and tonight, we're about to venture into the darkest corners of the human imagination. Brace yourself for tales that will leave you questioning what lurks just beyond the edge of your vision, and wondering if it's already too late to escape. In this special episode, we'll be delving into short horror stories written by none other than yours truly. So sit back, dim the lights, and prepare to hear the shadows come alive as we embark on a journey into the unknown. Our first story is titled, Have You Seen Her? A young man stands alone in an abandoned alleyway, breathing in the cigarette-filled air while staring into the bright lights of the city surrounding him. The crisp autumn air bites his skin like a sharp sheet of razors, gently pressing against his anatomy. Down the alleyway comes the sound of wheels squeaking against metal, reverberating against the buildings that surround the alley. Looking up, he notices an old woman pushing a shopping cart in his direction. The closer she gets, the more he sees the brittle and impoverished shape that the old lady is in. She's covered in mounds of dirt and rags from head to toe, as if this was her normal dress. As the old lady gets closer to the young man, her movements become slow and steady, with no indication she's aware of his presence. The squeaky wheels of the shopping cart grow louder with every step. The light of the alley shines over the old woman to reveal long, greasy hair covering her face. She continues walking down the alley, pushing the shopping cart of what appears to contain different fabrics and herbs. As she reaches the young man, her movements stop directly in front of him. Slowly, her head begins to turn in the direction of the young man. A feeling of uncertainty clouds the alleyway as the old lady makes her way towards the young man. Her hair still lays in front of her face, though the young man can feel her eyes staring right through him. "Have you seen her?" the old lady asks the young man. The sound of the old lady's voice feels like sandpaper against his ears, and shockwaves run through his entire body, like someone scraped their nails on a chalkboard. The man turns away and slowly walks down the alley away from the old lady. Before he reaches the end of the alley, a young girl comes from a dark corner, holding sticks in her hand. She stops the young man and tells him that she picked these sticks from her backyard. But looking more closely, the sticks have been fashioned in a way that resembles a house. The young girl grabs the man's hand and brings him to a wooden crate placed against a wall of the alley. She wipes off the top and gently places her stick house on top. As the sticks touch the wooden crate, a fly can be seen exiting through the chimney of the stick house. The door, fashioned with leaves and oak, resembles the shape of a mouth opening. From down the alleyway, the old woman can be heard yelling for the little girl, telling her to go back inside and stay in her room. The old woman has not moved from her spot from when she first encountered the young man. Her body appears feeble and weak, with every word spoken, almost as if it will be her last. The young girl grabs a hold of the young man's hand tightly and stares up at him, asking if he will come and play with her. The young man stares at the little girl in confusion and frustration, questions of why this little girl would make such an invitation to a stranger, and why the old lady hasn't moved from her position. All of these raid through the young man's head. Before he has a chance to respond to the little girl, he notices an eerie silence has taken over the alleyway. What is most often a busy street is empty from the sound of vehicles and foot traffic. From the silence comes the sound of tapping, and that sound is coming from the old lady. Every tap is a step forward towards the young man. The little girl releases her grip of the young man's hand and slowly begins to fade back into the corner from which she came, her eyes never straying from his as she descends back into the darkness. The young man looks behind him to see the old lady has made it closer in his direction. Though every time he looks back, the old lady refuses to continue forward. Keeping her gaze locked on the young man with each step taken, and looking into the darkness where the young girl disappeared into, the young man begins to see a silhouette forming. Not believing his eyes, he rubs them with his hands and tries to make some sense of what he's seeing. The silhouette forms odd and crooked body movements through the shadows and could be what is causing these visions. As the silhouette forms and moves, you can hear cracking, as if sticks are being broken in half or off from their tree. A smell begins to take over the young man's senses and fills his stomach with nausea. A tangy smell that reminds him of when he visited a slaughterhouse when he was younger. He always related this smell to be one that signaled death, which begins to send his mind into a flurry of anxiety. He kneels down on the ground to get a grasp on the overwhelming feelings surrounding him, when suddenly the noise stops. The smell still lingers, though it's not as powerful. The young man stands up swiftly, swings his body in the direction of the old lady. Her movement's now closer to him, providing an overwhelming sense of fear to the young man. The young man asks the old lady, "What do you want?" The old lady responds with, "Have you seen her?" The young man says that he's seen her. "You saw me with her. Is that your daughter?" he asks in hope to resolve whatever weird situation he's found himself in. The old lady slowly raises her arm and lifts a finger towards the dark corner where the silhouette and the little girl were seen. As she raises her arm, the young man notices her hair is no longer covering her face. The eyes of the old lady stare deep into the soul of the young man with a cold, dead pierce. Her face is covered with mud and dirt and signs of someone who's lived a long life. He slowly turns his head towards the darkness in which the old lady is pointing. Through the darkness, he once again sees that silhouette, though it's now taken a much more solid form. The silhouette begins to stretch its arms out towards the young man. He turns his body to run, but he's stopped in his place, almost as if someone's poured cement over his feet. The young man stays stuck in place while the silhouette begins to make its grasp even closer towards him. Darkness begins to lean over the young man and cover him like a blanket. The voice of the little girl can be heard through the darkness, saying not to struggle. The young man begins to feel pressure against his thorax, and his lungs begin to fill. Pressure begins to release from the young man, and air comes back into his lungs. He feels a hand placed on his shoulder as his body cowers to the ground trying to recover air. The hand provides a feeling of comfort and release. He turns his head towards the hand to see it covered and infested with flies. He looks up behind him to see the old lady standing over top of him, though not as he had last seen her. The old lady is covered in flies, with a torn, disfigured face, one that looks like it was crafted and placed over top her own. As she opens her mouth, a loud scream fills the young man's eardrums to the point of bursting. He raises his hands to cover the noise and is pushed against the wall by a force coming from the old lady. He sits against the wall, staring at this creature in fear, while it stares back at him deep into his eyes. A sinister grin begins to form as the skin falls off her face. This creature makes slow movements towards the young man, while he looks left and right for something to protect himself with. The creature kneels down once he reaches the young man. The tangy smell of death begins to fill his senses once again, to the point of overwhelming nausea. The creature reaches their hand out towards the young man and stops right in front of his face, pointing a single finger and staring at him deep into his soul. The feeling of fear begins to overtake the young man as his body feels like it's going to explode. The creature opens its mouth to release a swarm of flies surrounding the young man. Out of the creature's mouth comes 4 words. "Now you've seen her." Welcome back, listeners. If your heart's still racing from that first story, hold on tight, because the terror is far from over. In this next tale, I'm going to take you deeper into a world where the line between reality and nightmare begins to blur. What starts as an ordinary day quickly spirals into a horrifying descent that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about safety and sanity. Are you ready for what's coming next? Trust me, you might wish you weren't. Now let's continue our journey into the unknown. Our next story is called The Woman in the Red Dress. Prom night brings new and exciting experiences for teenagers, and Steve only has one thing on his mind: hooking up with Cassandra. "You okay to drive, Steve?" Brad held out his arm to block Steve from leaving the party, because Steve is known from time to time to make really terrible decisions when it comes to his own life. The dark night rolls through old country roads, and the winter gives no solace to those who dare to brave it. Piercing winds and white-colored powder cover the ground, making driving conditions treacherous and even more dangerous in Steve's condition. Steve pushes Brad out of the way and heads towards his Ford pickup truck, keys in hand. Pulling the door open, he throws himself into the driver's seat and slams it shut, looking back at the partygoers watching him pull out from the country cabin. Steve had had enough of the night. He'd been at the party with Cassandra, only to find her making out with Seth in the basement halfway through the night. He didn't want to drink tonight, though rage makes people do crazy things sometimes. The thought of losing the woman he spent all his high school years with is enough to drive a man crazy. Thoughts flood his mind alongside the onslaught of dizziness that comes with a night of drinking. His body continues to fill with rage as he drives through the old country backroads. There's no streetlights to pave the way, which makes these roads even more unforgiving. The Ford pickup feels like a hovercraft over these icy roads, and Steve is starting to wonder if he's still going in the right direction. It's then that he sees the outline of what is known as Ice 9, the big hill in town, and he breathes a sigh of relief. His house is only about 5 minutes east of Ice 9, so he knows as long as he takes it slow the rest of the way down the hill, he should be fine. As he reaches the top of the hill, he sees what looks like a red silhouette on the side of the road. As Steve gets closer, he realizes it's a woman walking in a long red dress, and he slowly approaches her. He rolls down his passenger side window and asks if she needs a ride. The woman in the red dress keeps walking, though her pace is much slower now. Steve yells louder, thinking the woman didn't hear his offer for help. The woman in the red dress stops dead in her tracks. Steve takes a minute to examine the woman and sees the dress itself is well kept and clean, her hair slightly ruffled and covering her face. She lifts her hands and slowly pulls the hair away from her face, still staring in the direction that she was walking originally. She leans her body down towards Steve's vehicle and opens the passenger side door, keeping her gaze locked on the direction in front of her. The lady picks her dress up elegantly as she makes her way into the vehicle without leaving a stain on the red dress. Steve asks the lady where she's heading tonight, but the woman in the red dress stays silent, staring out the windshield into the darkness in front of them. Steve starts to feel concern for the lady and the awkward silence that accompanies her. He asks if maybe she's in danger. Steve continues to try and spark some kind of conversation with the woman, only to hear silence in return. The woman starts shaking from the cold, which prompts Steve to turn up the heat in the vehicle. She still doesn't say a word, especially when he pulls over and takes off his coat to place it over her, trying to keep her warm. The woman continues to make no movement or even acknowledge Steve in any way as he puts his jacket around her. This starts to frustrate Steve as he turns the keys of his vehicle and continues on through the old country roads. Steve makes his way back into the edge of town safely, along with the woman in the red dress. Before they make it to the streetlights shining in the middle of town, the woman makes her first movement since entering the vehicle. She slowly begins to raise her arm and points towards an old blue house on the corner block outside of town. Steve asks if that's where she lives, though the woman in the red dress still makes no acknowledgement, only keeping her arm raised, pointing in the direction of the old blue house. Steve is getting more and more frustrated as the silence in the truck grows. He's really starting to regret this decision of picking up a beautiful hitchhiker, especially while he's driving inebriated. Steve turns to the woman and begins telling her that the considerate thing to do would at least tell him where they're going so he can drop her off. The woman continues to say nothing, only pointing to the blue house. Steve begins to pick up speed and get this woman dropped off so he can be done with this crazy night and head on home. He starts to think of Cassandra again, and what she would think of him picking up a beautiful hitchhiker, in hopes that maybe he could get some revenge out of this. All those concerns go out the window once the image of her in the basement with Seth came back to the forefront. Steve finally reaches the blue house and is feeling relief that this awkward encounter can finally be over. The woman opens the passenger side door and heads towards the old blue house. Steve rolls down the window to ask for his jacket back, but he loses sight of the woman in the red dress. Steve begins to reflect on how weird the situation with this woman was. She never said a word, never acknowledged anything he did, and this really began to fill him with rage. His desire to just relinquish himself of this awkward encounter is replaced with a feeling of humiliation and rejection. He begins to feel like everyone is out to get him. First Cassandra and now this woman, both humiliating him and leaving him in a state of rejection. That was his varsity jacket, and like hell he was going to let some random woman take it from him. So he opens the driver's side door and begins to make his way towards the old blue house to retrieve his jacket from the woman. Walking towards the house, the pathway is lined with weeds leading to a garden that hasn't been maintained in many seasons. He opens the screen door and knocks 3 times. An old lady answers the door with a look of confusion across her face. Steve tells her that he just dropped off a woman in a red dress here and she left before he could get his jacket back, so he asks if he can have his jacket. The confusion that stained the face of the old lady quickly turns to sadness. Her entire body begins to crumble, to the point where it looks like she's going to collapse. Steve puts his arms around the old lady to prevent her from falling and asks if she's okay or needs medical help. The old lady slides down to the ground and puts her head in her hands. The old lady turns her head up to Steve and begins to tell him that 15 years ago, her daughter was at a party after her senior prom. She wore a beautiful white dress that matched her boyfriend's beautiful white tuxedo. After prom, they ended up at a friend's house for a party, and on their way home, her boyfriend drove their car off of Ice 9 and through the barricade. She didn't survive the accident. The last time that the old lady saw her was when they had to identify the body, her white dress covered in blood from head to toe. They buried her in the cemetery just off of the exit from where she died. Steve backs away from the old woman in sheer fear and makes his way back to the vehicle. Sitting in the driver's seat, he stares through the windshield, both confused and scared about what he just experienced. Steve takes one look back at the old blue house and only sees its dark reflection casting back at him. He turns the keys in his ignition and makes his way into town, back home for the night. The next day, Steve drives the same route to pick up some of his friends from the party the night before. Driving through Ice 9, he keeps an eye out for the mysterious woman in the red dress. He never sees her on his journey back through Ice 9, though he catches a quick glimpse of the cemetery, the one the old lady mentioned she was buried in. Steve makes a quick detour before heading to pick up his friends and decides to visit the cemetery. As he puts his vehicle in park, he realizes he doesn't even know the woman's name, which is going to make looking for a gravestone quite difficult. Still, he gets out of his vehicle and begins walking around the cemetery for any sign of the woman in the red dress. As he gets deeper into the cemetery, he sees something draped over a gravestone. He makes his way over and sees his varsity jacket on the grave of the woman in the red dress. With every story, the shadows grow darker and the terror becomes more tangible. But what if the true horror isn't something you can see, but something you can't escape? In our next tale, we journey into a nightmare where the very fabric of reality begins to unravel. What starts as an unsettling feeling soon spirals into a mind-bending terror that will leave you questioning the world around you. The question now is, can you survive what's about to come? Our next story is titled Drip, Drip. Tonight is the big night, the Hammerhead Ball. the biggest night of the year where all the lavish families of the neighborhood get together and celebrate their success. One of the richest families in town, the Arks, are preparing for their evening out while trying to contain their 15-year-old daughter, Vanessa. She's struck the age of independence and doesn't feel she has any need for a babysitter. The Arks are concerned about their daughter's safety, as really they've never left her alone in the house before. While their family isn't necessarily vulnerable to an attack, it would be ignorant to assume they wouldn't be a target for a robbery. Vanessa Ark makes her way through the lobby towards her father, lightly tapping his shoulder to get his attention, saying that she's 15 now and doesn't need a babysitter. She's just going to be watching TV alone in her room. Mr. Ark responds to her in a very firm tone, saying it has nothing to do with your responsibility. The concern is for your safety. Mrs. Ark steps in, saying that the ball won't be going too late into the night and should maybe be away for a few hours at most. She convinces her husband to let the girl have a night of freedom. She's been an advocate for Vanessa to have more independence as she continues to grow into adulthood. Mr. Ark turns in his wife's direction and shoots a look that resembles an agreement. Mr. Ark then turns to his daughter, tells her to set the alarm after they leave and stay in her room for the night. He places his hand on her shoulder and she grips it with a smile from ear to ear. The Arks finish getting ready for the evening and proceed to make their way to their vehicle. Vanessa waves goodbye as they drive away from their old blue house, closes the front door, and arms the security system. She turns around and runs upstairs to her room, landing on her bed stacked with snacks. She props herself up on the bed and scrolls through shows to watch. Bzz, bzz. Vanessa's cell phone begins to vibrate on her bed, and she looks down to see a phone call from her dad. She answers the phone and lets him know she set the security system and she's just in her room watching TV. Satisfied, her dad hangs up the call and wishes his daughter a good night. Vanessa finally finds one of her favorite TV shows and gets ready to settle in when she hears dripping noises in her room. She heads towards her bedroom window to see if they were lucky enough to get some rain. Vanessa loves the rain and would most likely break her word to Dad about staying in her room if she could take a minute to dance in the rain. Looking out her bedroom window, she sees nothing but the sun setting and clear skies. The dripping sound seems to have stopped now. Vanessa heads back to her bed and lies down with her hand draped down the side of the bed. She fawns over the teen heartthrob of her favorite show, enjoying her snacks and playing with her dog Molly under the bed. Her hand draped down the side of the bed, she can feel Molly licking her fingers and enjoying the residue her snacks leave behind. Vanessa always takes comfort in Molly. She's had her since Molly was a puppy and raised her to be the cuddle dog she is today. Bzz, bzz. Vanessa looks down to see her dad calling again. She answers her phone. He asks her what she's up to and how her night's going. After explaining what she was watching and going into extensive detail about the relationships of the main characters, her dad had had enough and told her that they'd be home in a little over an hour. Vanessa hangs up with her dad and heads towards the bathroom to get ready for sleep. As she makes her way back to the bedroom, she begins to hear the dripping noises again. Only this time, they're much louder than they were before. She makes her way back towards the bathroom to try and find the source of the dripping. Slowly opening the door, she turns on the light and looks around the shower and sink area. No water is coming out, but she can still hear the sound of dripping. She leaves the bathroom and walks to the room beside it, which is her parents' room. She was always told to never enter the room without permission, but she needs to make sure there's nothing wrong. As she enters her parents' room, she sees their bed nicely made and drapes closed over their roof-to-floor windows. Having their own bathroom, Vanessa proceeds to check if there's anything dripping in there. She finds nothing wrong in her parents' bedroom, nothing wrong in her parents' bathroom, and makes her way back towards the end of the hall where her bedroom is. The dripping sound increasingly gets louder the closer she gets towards her bedroom. Confusion begins to fill Vanessa's mind, since there's nothing in her room that could be causing that noise. She starts to think maybe one of the pipes is leaking in the ceiling, or maybe there's some sort of rodent in the walls. When Vanessa walks into her room, she finds no water on the floor or anything that could be causing the sound she's hearing. Vanessa then notices that her closet door is slightly ajar, and the dripping noises seem to be coming from inside the closet. She slowly makes her way towards the closet door, placing her hand on the handle to pull the door open. A piercing shriek can be heard blocks away coming from within the Ark House. Vanessa falls to the floor, staring in sheer fear at what's inside her closet. The walls of the closet are dark red from the bloodstained splatter of what is hanging in the middle of the closet. Molly sways back and forth with blood dripping onto the floor and swinging into the wall to add another coat of paint. A note written on a white piece of paper is pinned into Molly with a small blade. Written on the note are the words, "Humans lick too." Bzz, bzz. Vanessa's phone vibrates on her bed. As the air grows colder and the shadows stretch longer, we find ourselves standing on the precipice of yet another nightmare. But this time, the terror doesn't come from the unknown. It comes from something far closer, something you might already know. Are you ready to face what's lurking just beneath the surface? This next tale is called The Pavilion. A full moon rises in the crisp autumn night with a bitter chill falling over the small town of Anisoptero. Dark clouds can be seen forming across the mountain skyline, adding an ominous hue over the darkness that lurks deep in the shadows of Anisoptero. Overtop the gravel road that links Anisoptero to the rest of the world lingers a presence that sweeps its way through the town's streets. Stopping outside the pavilion, a structure which sits in the middle of town, is the hub where many townspeople meet to discuss political matters, and a man is currently standing outside. His name is Sentry, and he was once a resident of Anisoptero. Now, he stands outside the pavilion with feelings of remorse, regret, and dread. The lingering presence disappears into the night, leaving a sheet of darkness over the pavilion. Sentry turns to look behind him, after having a feeling of being watched. Looking into the deep dark night, he sees the streetlights illuminating the homes in the neighborhood, without a person in sight. Sentry stares through the windows of the pavilion, into the sadness and despair that echoes through the dark halls of this building. A place once filled with life, now rotting from death consuming its roots. Sentry enters the pavilion through the secret entrance he and his crew had made decades prior. A small trap door placed about 10 yards away from the south side of the pavilion. This gave them easy access to the basement area of the pavilion, where they could get anywhere else they needed to. He makes his way through the basement into the reception lobby. Taking in his surroundings, a flood of memories begin to flow through Sentry's brain. He begins to reminisce the first time he visited the pavilion, when he was 6 years old. A fond memory of his father bringing him to the pavilion one summer, where he learned an understanding of society. The patriarchy and authority of the town was something his father stood by, and bestowed those same values onto Sentry. These memories begin to fade into the dark lobby that Sentry finds himself in. The lobby remains in good condition considering the events prior. Gold lining still holds strong through the wooden oak walls that somehow keep this building still standing. Sentry puts his hand on a banister and rests his head, trying to fight the sadness and remorse that fills his soul with every step he takes inside the pavilion. He eventually makes his way out of the lobby and begins to question what brought him back here in the first place. He swore he'd never return to Anisoptero, especially after what happened and the amount of bodies they had to bury. Yet, there's a feeling which pulls him directly towards the center of the building. Sentry makes his way through the reception lobby towards the offices when he hears a sound, which makes him stop dead in his tracks. A strange noise is coming from the end of the hallway, yet Sentry sees nobody in sight. The pavilion stopped being used by the town after the murders, which leaves Sentry alone in a dark building. He pulls a lighter out of his pocket and gets some sort of light to help him guide his path towards the noise. As he cautiously makes his way down the hallway, Sentry finds a little girl cowering underneath a desk. He approaches the distressed girl slowly and with extreme caution. She lifts her head and stares deep into Sentry's eyes with a look of tragic despair. Her eyes filled with tears, she quickly puts her head back in her crossed arms, sobbing profusely. Sentry asks her what happened. She gives him her hand, and he lifts her from underneath the desk. He tells her that she's safe and wants to know what happened to the little girl. The little girl opens her mouth to say words, but only screams of terror and cries of despair come out. Through the cries, though, Sentry tries to decipher the ramblings and catches the word family. Sentry, confused and concerned for the little girl, asks her where her family is. The little girl stares at the floor, and her sobs begin to slow. Her entire body goes limp and her face turns white. She slowly lifts her head towards Sentry and just tells him that she wants to go home. Sentry stands up and takes another look around the pavilion. He doesn't see anyone nearby and is starting to question how this little girl made her way in here. With the doors permanently locked and the only way in being his secret passage, there's no way this little girl could have made it in here by herself. Sentry picks up the little girl and makes his way back down to the basement. She begins to yell that they can't leave because he'll be so angry. He puts the little girl down and puts his hands on her face, asking her who will be angry. Is there someone else here with you? Memories of the last time he stepped foot inside the pavilion begin to flood back to him, and his heart begins to race. Bodies piled one atop another with shards of glass flying through the air. They had managed to stop this before, but Sentry realized it was never a permanent solution. The child tells Sentry that he forces them to play a role, and she doesn't want to play this game anymore. She falls to the floor and places her head back in her hands. Sentry says to the little girl that he's going to get her out of here and it's going to be okay, and asks her what are these roles they have you playing. The little girl slowly lifts her head, tilting it awkwardly as she stares deep into Sentry's eyes and says that her role is Lure. And now we arrive at the final chapter of tonight's journey into fear. By now, the night has fully claimed you, and there's no turning back. But this last story, it's different. It's the kind of horror that lingers long after the story ends, haunting your every step. This is it. This is our final tale of the episode, and it's called Chrissy. Chrissy is a simple girl who likes simple things. Well, more like simply things. She's a completely materialistic girl who finds herself running out of toys to play with or accessories to collect. Her friends consider her an idol, while she's a little princess to her parents. Though what none of them know is, Chrissy has a very dark side, one that she only shows to those that cross her. Take Adriana, for example. She thought that taking one of her dolls from the toy box at recess was a good idea. Think again. Chrissy grabbed Adriana by the back of her head and shoved her face into the sandbox. Her crew of mean girls built a wall around them, preventing any of the teachers a chance to see it. This was Chrissy's MO. She always has to be in charge, and she always gets what she wants. The bell rings to end off the day, and everyone is excited for the weekend. Chrissy and her family are heading out on a vacation to Niagara Falls, which is her first time being to another country. She did nothing but brag about it for at least a month, making sure everybody knew that her and her family was going to Niagara Falls. I never saw anything special. It's not like she was going to Disneyland. When Chrissy came home from school, her parents were getting everything packed and ready to go. Her first stop was the bedroom, to make sure she had all the necessary accessories and dolls packed for her trip. She noticed that her mirror wasn't packed and raced down to get it and added it to her luggage. Chrissy can never be without a mirror. Everywhere she goes, she needs to look at herself. It's a top priority to make sure she looks good at all times, and if she doesn't, she'll lock herself away until someone gives her what she wants. For example, one time they had to lock down the girls' bathroom in the school because Chrissy locked herself in a stall and made a scene. From what was heard, someone was washing their face in the sink and splashed the water a little too high. They ended up spraying Chrissy in the face and causing some of her makeup to run. This sent her into an absolute frenzy where she started banging on the stall doors before locking herself inside. The girl who committed the act of ruining Chrissy's day was Jennifer, and from her perspective, Chrissy smashed the mirror beside her and grabbed a shard of glass. Jennifer thought she was going to come after her with it, but Chrissy ended up smashing the stalls with it. Apparently, nobody saw shards of glass anywhere in the bathroom, so this could have been just a rumor. Although, from what I know of Chrissy, I'd be inclined to believe it's true. Chrissy and her family get into their van and head out towards Niagara Falls. I can hear them talking and laughing about where they're going to stop on the way and what attractions they want to see most. Chrissy is most excited for the wave pools and ziplining. It surprises me that she's going for daredevil attractions, considering how guarded her appearance is. One fall from a zipline, and only plastic surgery can help you now, provided you live that long. Not to mention that wave pools will sure muddy up that makeup caked face of hers. Both options sound like someone is going to face Chrissy's wrath. The rest of the drive down is fairly quiet. My guess is Chrissy fell asleep, considering the silence for the last half of their drive. I start to wonder about Chrissy's home life and what it's actually like. You see, my parents talk all the time, and are rarely apart, yet, at the first chance, these two have alone with each other, neither one of them have said a word. Chrissy, though, would never notice. She's too self-involved to realize that her own family unit is crumbling at the seams. This whole vacation was probably some last-ditch effort to keep her family together. The van finally makes its stop, and Chrissy wakes up to her dad shouting, "We're here." Her face goes wide at the sight of Niagara Falls. The wide vastness of it and how beautiful it is when the sun shines on it. Chrissy rubs her eyes and tries to wake herself up enough to get out of the van and get a better look. Her dad makes it clear that if she is going up to the rail and see the falls up close, she can't bring anything with her. No mirrors, no dolls, nothing. Which is a smart move considering how clumsy a child can be, and he probably wants to avert any potential disaster if his little princess loses a doll or, God forbid, the mirror. Chrissy takes out her pocket mirror and does a look over her face to make sure she's good enough to be seen in public. After giving herself the final check, she goes out of the van and heads down towards the rail. The bustling street and all the people going up and down Clifton Hill behind her fills her with ego. She feels like she's the cutest girl within a 10-mile radius with all eyes on her. Chrissy makes her way down to the rail and takes in the beauty of Niagara Falls. Chrissy hears her dad yell at her from back in the van, asking if she wants to take any pictures. I'm guessing she said yes, because her dad ended up leaving the driver's seat to come into the back area of the van and grab the camera. You can imagine his surprise when he found me laying there amongst all the family's luggage. At first, his face was one of confusion as to who I was and how I had gotten into their van. It wasn't until seconds later that his face turned to sheer fear and his eyes went really wide. He let out a gut-wrenching scream as I pushed the knife deep into his abdomen. He took a few steps back, holding the knife in his stomach, and it wasn't until a few moments later that anyone really noticed what was going on. That gave me enough time to get what I wanted this time. I got out of the van and walked down towards the rail where Chrissy stood. My hope was that she didn't turn around before I got there, but I can only be so lucky in a day. As her blonde head turned to face me, and she showed anger that I would even dare be standing so close to her, Chrissy asked me, "Adriana, what are you doing here?" I pushed her over the rail and watched her body bounce off the rocks and disappear. Screams followed all around me as I walked through the crowd and away from everyone. I stopped in front of her mom as she knelt crying beside her husband and whispered the words, "Chrissy died ugly." And so our journey into the dark corners of the mind comes to a close. But remember, what we've explored tonight doesn't simply vanish when the lights go out. These stories linger, hiding in the shadows, waiting for you to forget, and then return when you least expect it. Thank you for joining us here at Cabin of Horrors. If you dare to return, we'll be waiting, with more tales that will keep you questioning the line between nightmare and reality. Until then, stay safe, or at least stay aware. Because in the Cabin of Horrors, the stories never truly end.